So welcome back to the second part of the workshop that starts with this session entitled The Borders of the Republic, National Self-Determination and Non-Domination, in which after discussing these theoretical, economic and historical foundations of republicanism in the last sessions, we will address the issue of what republicanism can say about self-determination, secession, and the crisis of the nation states. And so it will be also very quite strongly related to the so-called demos problem, that more than one here has studied in previous works. So I think it will be an inspiring session, and that without doubt it will give room to a fruitful open debate after the three presentations. With me are Lluís Pérez, Andreas Oldenbourg, and Sergi Morales, to whom I thank for being here. Thank you for being here. Lluís Pérez is the academic director of the Fundació Josep Irla, the responsible of this workshop. Besides, he's adjunct professor and researcher at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at Universitat Pompeu Fabra here in Barcelona. His research lines are democratic theories in general, and more specifically the Republican tradition and its connections with secession, nationalism, and also religious pluralism, among other things. And just a couple of months ago, in May 2022, he published the article Toward a Republican Theory of Secession at the Academic Journal of Social Philosophy, which, as many other references that I'm mentioning today, it's published in open access. So if you want, you can just check them after the session. Then Andreas Oldenbourg is academic coordinator of the interdisciplinary research group Normative Constituents of Democracy at the Berlin-Brandenburgische Academy of Sciences and Humanities, that examines how to strengthen the normative foundations of liberal democracies facing the current political scenario. And he recently published the book Wer ist das Volk? Eine republikanische Theorie der Secession. I haven't found a translation, but I think it would be something like Who are the People? A Republican Theory of Secession. And then the third one is Sergi Morales. He's a Marie Sklodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Limerick in Ireland, and also a member of the Political Theory Research Group at UPF. And his research is mainly focused on linguistic justice and republicanism, but also on issues related to distributive justice, nationalism, and the right to self-determination and secession. And his latest publication, if I'm not wrong, Sergi, is the article Is Speaking One's Own Language a Right in Nations and Nationalism? So his presentation will be in Catalan. It's the only one of the roundtable, and the other ones will be in English. So we can start with you, Sergi, and then Andreas, and then Lluís. Go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for this really kind presentation, and thank you also to the Josep Irla Foundation for allowing me to facilitate to give my speech in Catalan, which is okay. I mean, it's good for me because it facilitates my talk, but at the same time, I think it's also an issue of linguistic justice. So considering that I am going to talk about that, I feel like I have the obligation to read in Catalan. So gràcies a tothom per ser aquí, a la Fundació Josep Irla per convidar-me, a tots els ponents, sobretot doncs, els que ho han organitzat, Lluís, Pere, Guillem, per la feina, i sobretot als traductors o les traductores que estan fent aquesta feina tan complicada ara mateix. Gràcies per la vostra feina. Avui parlaré d'un concepte que porto anys treballant des de la tesi doctoral, de fet, que és el concepte de dominació lingüística. Durant la meva tesi jo vaig començar a treballar en aquesta idea per intentar desenvolupar una teoria alternativa a les mainstream dins de les discussions de justícia lingüística, que eren eminentment liberals, i vaig intentar desenvolupar una teoria alternativa o complementària que es volia nodrir de certes idees relacionades que tradicionalment ha defensat el republicanisme. Aleshores, què és això de la dominació lingüística? Començo una mica amb certes premisses o amb certes idees que m'agradaria explicar. La meva preocupació essencial amb la qüestió de la dominació lingüística és doble. D'una banda, hi ha un cert discurs públic, a Catalunya especialment, però a molts altres llocs, on s'utilitza aquest llenguatge de llengua dominant, llengua dominada, etc. En anglès, per exemple, el mateix Will Kimbley, que en el seu llibre tan important sobre la ciutadania multicultural de l'any 95, ell utilitza a vegades aquest llenguatge. Parla de linguistic dominance, per exemple. No defineix què significa això, però s'utilitza. I en el discurs públic s'utilitza també aquest tipus de llenguatge moltes vegades, però ningú acaba d'especificar què vol dir això. Tampoc a l'acadèmia. I aquí és on entro jo intentant desenvolupar aquesta idea. Els que sí que ho han estudiat a nivell més empíric són els sociòlegs i els sociolingüistes. Tenim gent, començant per Bourdieu, que és conegut en diverses disciplines, però molts altres, sociolingüistes, que han treballat sobre què és això de la dominació lingüística i que han vingut a dir que la dominació lingüística vindria a ser o tindria alguna relació amb com les eleccions lingüístiques de les persones, els usos de les llengües que fan les persones, es formen. En quines condicions i per què les persones parlen aquesta llengua i no una altra, quines condicions socials es donen quan això passa, etcètera. I, per tant, quines actituds lingüístiques tenen les persones, sobretot respecte a les seves llengües i també a la dels altres, com tracten els altres segons la llengua que parlen, etcètera. I que això vindria influenciat per una cosa que ells li anomenen ideologies lingüístiques, que ara no entraré a parlar d'això perquè això ja s'escapa una mica de la temàtica, però el que sí que jo he notat és que no hi ha una definició clara de què significa això de la dominació lingüística exactament. No hi ha una conceptualització. I per tant, la meva idea és la de desenvolupar una teoria general de la dominació lingüística, per tant, contribuint als debats de justícia lingüística amb un intent de definir què és això. Aquesta és, com he dit, la meva pregunta de recerca, per tant, què és això de la dominació lingüística i quan hi té lloc, en quines condicions. Per fer-ho, he utilitzat bàsicament dues literatures. D'una banda, la literatura de les teories de la justícia lingüística, dins del gran marc de la teoria política, i la literatura de la tradició republicana de pensament dins de la teoria política. Les teories de la justícia lingüística, per qui no estigui familiaritzat amb aquesta literatura, el que ve a tractar és la idea de quins principis haurien d'informar les nostres institucions quan has de gestionar la diversitat lingüística en una societat que se suposa que és complexa lingüísticament, ja sigui per la migració, ja sigui perquè hi ha minories que parlen llengües diferents a les llengües dominants, o inclús també per la qüestió de la llengua franca, l'anglès com a llengua franca, un fenomen que cada cop ja no és emergent, abans sí que era emergent, però ara diguem que és una cosa més establerta. Per tant, tracta sobre aquestes qüestions. I també, en última instància, sobre quin és el valor exacte de la llengua. Per què la llengua és important per les persones? Quin valor té? Quins interessos tenim les persones darrere d'aquesta noció que és les llengües. I d'altra banda, la literatura de republicanisme, que crec que no fa falta que l'expliqui aquí perquè n'hem parlat abans a bastament, i tota la idea de la llibertat com a no dominació, etc. Aleshores, entrem en el tema. Què és la dominació lingüística o com jo he intentat desenvolupar aquesta idea de què és la dominació lingüística. Per tant, primer, el que jo faig és utilitzar la definició mainstream, la més habitual, que és la de Philip Pettit, sobre com defineix la dominació lingüística. Les persones o grups experimenten dominació lingüística quan estan subjectes a una capacitat incontrolada d'interferència sobre certes eleccions i ho pateixen per agents tercers, siguin els estats, siguin empreses, siguin altres persones, etc. Això és el frame general de Pettit. Abans de continuar amb això, un es podria preguntar per què exactament la llengua hauria d'encaixar dins d'aquesta preocupació per la dominació. És a dir, per què les persones, per què els republicans, aquells que estem preocupats per la qüestió de dominació, ens hauria d'importar la llengua en última instància. Per què no? Abans, per exemple, el David ens parlava de les condicions materials. Això és una preocupació republicana. Per què les llengües han d'estar incorporades aquí també? Amb això, òbviament, no hi entraré al detall perquè aleshores no podria explicar-ho tot, però donaria dues idees de per què crec que són importants pels republicans i en general per tothom que estigui preocupat per la justícia. Primer, pels interessos que en derivem de les llengües. Les persones tenim certs interessos amb les llengües que són rellevants. Hi ha molta discussió sobre quins són exactament aquests interessos però el que està clar és que els tenim, ni que sigui a nivell comunicatiu. Les persones tenim interès en comunicar-nos. Comunicar-nos és molt important per a la nostra vida social. Per tant, això és un. I dos, perquè la llengua és un element essencial del que diu rols, una cooperative adventure. Qualsevol cooperative adventure que diu rols, qualsevol societat que discuteix amb ella mateixa sobre quins principis de justícia han de regular-la, necessita de llengua o de llengües, necessàriament. Per tant, la llengua com a element essencial és important per conceptualitzar i teoritzar sobre com hem de viure junts. Sobretot quan hi ha més d'una llengua. Si només hi hagués una llengua no hi hauria gaire problema, en principi, però si n'hi ha, vol dir que hi haurà conflicte i que això ho hem de regular. Per tant, apliquem petit, aquest marc, a la qüestió de les llengües. I he vingut a definir la dominació lingüística d'aquesta manera. Hi ha dominació lingüística si una persona, un grup o una institució política és capaç d'exercir una interferència incontrolada, per tant, la definició de petit, sobre l'estatus lingüístic i l'adquisició lingüística dels individus o dels grups. D'acord? Què significa? Com que no definiré què és exactament per petit una interferència incontrolada, perquè més o menys això ja ho hem estat discutint i ja més o menys sabem què és el que és, sí que definiré els altres dos conceptes que segurament no són tan comuns, que és això de l'estatus lingüístic i de l'adquisició. L'adquisició lingüística és fàcil, és la transmissió i el coneixement de la llengua. Quan els pares ens transmeten una llengua als fills, o a les escoles transmeten una llengua, o quan tu t'apuntes a un lloc per aprendre una llengua, doncs això és l'adquisició lingüística. I l'estatus lingüístic són dues coses, eminentment, pels sociolingüistes. Tot això són definicions que trec de la sociolingüística. L'estatus és bàsicament dues coses. Primer, l'estatus legal d'una llengua dins del corpus jurídic d'una comunitat política. Doncs l'estatus que tingui és això, quin lloc ocupa aquesta llengua dins del nostre ordenament jurídic i també, com a conseqüència, quines funcions té aquesta llengua. Perquè, per exemple, l'anglès no té un estatus oficial a l'estat espanyol, però té funcions dins de l'administració espanyola, per exemple, perquè s'ensenya a les escoles, cosa que, per exemple, m'ho invento, l'àrab no té, per posar un exemple. O que té molt menor grau, en llocs molt concrets, perquè veia ara el Pau ben així, però perquè ens entenguem. Per tant, l'estatus vindria a ser això. Això és la primera part. La segona part de l'estatus és que també són els usos que les persones fan en el seu dia a dia, en les seves pràctiques lingüístiques amb els altres. Per tant, els sociolingüistes defineixen l'estatus d'aquestes dues maneres. Per tant, la dominació lingüística s'exerciria sobre aquests dos nivells, bàsicament. Petit el que també fa és que ens diu que la dominació la pot exercir diversos agents. El pot exercir un privat, sigui un individu, sigui una empresa o sigui un grup d'individus, i això és el que anomena un dominium, o la pot exercir l'Estat, la comunitat política i les seves institucions, i això és el que ell parla d'imperium. Jo aquí, aplicat a la llengua, utilitzo aquests dos conceptes. El dominium vindria a ser el que anomeno la dominació lingüística horitzontal, la donada entre privats, a les converses diàries que tenim o en els usos lingüístics que es fan les empreses, per exemple, amb els seus productes, i l'imperium és el que fa l'Estat, les regulacions de l'Estat respecte als temes de la llengua. I aplico aquesta distinció, com he dit, sobre les llengües. Ara em centraré en la qüestió vertical, no en l'horitzontal, perquè de fet l'horitzontal tinc un article ja en peer review i per tant no m'interessa tant tractar-lo ara. Parlaré més de la vertical perquè és la que estic treballant ara mateix i per tant la que m'interessa més escoltar què és el que creieu. Per tant, què és això de la dominació lingüística vertical? I el que dic és hi ha dominació lingüística vertical quan les institucions polítiques són capaces d'exercir una interferència incontrolada sobre l'estatus de les llengües i l'adquisició que tenen les persones de les llengües. Un es pot imaginar de manera relativament fàcil, a més tenim exemples empírics a tot arreu, com això aplica als diversos nivells que he explicat abans, l'estatus i l'adquisició. Per exemple, a nivell d'estatus, per exemple, amb el reconeixement de la llengua a nivell legal. Si reconeixes o no, a casa nostra, el català com a llengua oficial de la llengua de l'Estat o no ho fas. I com ho practiques això. També les funcions que té la llengua dins de l'Estat o dins de les coses que són competència de l'Estat en diversos àmbits. Per exemple, quina llengua s'utilitza a l'escola. I també en els usos de la gent. Us podeu imaginar un estat molt coercitiu i autoritari que prohibeix, per exemple, literalment l'ús de determinades llengües. Per exemple, prohibint diaris, que es publiquin diaris en una llengua o una altra. però també coses més indirectes i no tan coercitives. Per exemple, quan un estat subvenciona la indústria audiovisual en una sola llengua i, per tant, d'alguna manera està influint en els usos lingüístics i en l'estatus de les llengües. Jo només pago pel·lícules en aquesta llengua. En la resta jo no pago res, per exemple. I, finalment, en l'adquisició. Amb l'adquisició lingüística és molt fàcil. Les escoles o àmbit de formació i aprenentatge de llengües. Quines llengües tu promous en l'àmbit de l'adquisició lingüística i quines no. Per evitar aquestes possibles dominacions que pot exercir l'Estat en general i en particular sobre les llengües, Petit el que ens diu, tot i que Petit no parla mai de les llengües, Petit el que ens diu és que per evitar-ho, per evitar aquesta dominació per part de les institucions, del poder polític, necessitem tenir, la ciutadania necessita tenir un cert control sobre les accions de l'Estat. I això implica dues coses. Primer, que tots els individus tinguin una influència igual sobre el procés de presa de decisió política, d'una banda, i segon, que aquesta influència, és a dir, que aquesta igual influència tingui una capacitat d'imposar el que diu una relevant direction a la decisió. Jo això ara no ho discutiré, és a dir, no discutiré si aquesta definició em sembla perfecta o no em sembla perfecta. Simplement assumeixo el marc de Petit per intentar parlar sobre aquesta qüestió, dono aquesta definició de Petit per bona i l'aplicaré a la qüestió de la llengua. La pregunta, per tant, és, utilitzant el frame de Petit, és si aquesta capacitat de tenir una influència i imposar una direcció a la presa de decisions sobre les qüestions de les llengües és equally shared, si està igualment compartida per tothom en el procés de presa de decisions. I aquí és on el problema, diguem-ne, comença, especialment quan parlem de qüestions de llengua, on el paper del clàssic problema de la tirania de la majoria juga un paper segurament molt important a la presa de decisions i amb la qüestió de la dominació, sobretot si es donen certes condicions que ara explicaré. Perquè la qüestió és què passa en comunitats polítiques on hi ha persones que estan situades en el que tradicionalment s'ha anomenat minories permanents o majories permanents. És a dir, persones que formen part de grups que, per X característiques, difícilment poden escapar d'aquesta condició com a membre d'aquell grup i que difícilment tindran la capacitat de sortir d'aquesta condició de minoria o de majoria. En aquest cas, què passa amb ells en els processos de presa de decisions, sobretot quan ho apliquem a qüestions lingüístiques. Comparteixen aquests grups o aquestes persones que formen part d'aquests grups minoritaris el que diu Petit, equally shared control sobre les decisions que les institucions poden prendre sobre les qüestions de reconeixement de les llengües o de promoció de les llengües, de les regulacions lingüístiques. I la meva hipòtesi, la meva tesi és que no. I això és així perquè alguns grups no tenen les mateixes oportunitats ex ante d'estar en el sector guanyador de la discussió política dins d'una deliberació democràtica. I us poso un exemple molt ràpid. Imaginem un Parlament amb un 70% de diputats que són parlants de la llengua A i un 30% que són parlants de la llengua B i que més o menys representen la demografia sociolingüística del territori, del país. Independentment de quines siguin les preferències dels parlants de llengua B, que és el grup petit, d'alguna manera estaran a expenses de la bona fe del grup majoritari per decidir què és el que volen. És a dir, si per exemple decidissin assimilar-se a la llengua A i promocionar només la llengua A, segurament no hi hauria cap problema. Però a mesura que potser aquestes preferències no són les mateixes que les del grup A, dependran de la bona fe, tindran un conflicte i segurament no tindran cap capacitat de fer-hi gaire cosa al respecte perquè l'altre grup és el preponderant demogràficament, etc. I això també és veritat. Petit utilitza un concepte que em sembla que és bastant pertinent, no utilitza permanent, sinó utilitza sticky, per una mica, perquè clar, que una cosa sigui permanent és una mica difícil de sostenir, però aquesta idea de l'sticky, d'enganxós, crec que és bastant apropiada. I sobretot hi ha un altre autor, que és Rainer Baubock, que és un científic polític, i el que explica és que sobretot les majories lingüístiques són les que són especialment permanents, són les que són difícilment permeables. Les minories habitualment sí que s'acaben modificant per diversos motius. En canvi, les majories lingüístiques són molt permanents i difícilment són modificables, almenys amb les dades que tenim ara sobre la taula. I per tant, això pot generar patrons democràtics que són problemàtics, perquè dones un cert privilegi de poder a alguns per sobre d'uns altres. Si això és veritat, si el meu argument és veritat, el que d'alguna manera ens està insinuant és que el que tenim en última instància ja no només és un problema de poder perquè hi ha una distribució, perquè hi ha un grup que té un privilegi de poder en el sentit d'un poder més insubstancial, és a dir, que a través de normes socials, per exemple, sinó que el que bàsicament hi és un problema numèric. Això hi ha un filòsof que està a McGill, que és en Arash Avizadeh, que ho ha treballat bastant i que ha publicat un paper recentment on parla del concepte de power of numbers i utilitza per aplicar-ho a la qüestió de les minories i majories permanents i diu que el power of numbers, que el poder que t'atorguen els números, pot ser un problema, quan es donen aquests casos, que trenca amb la igualtat democràtica. I, per tant, amb la idea aquesta de Petit de la equal shared influence, que he esmentat abans. Per tant, tornant a Petit, aquí crec que la qüestió central seria definir quan exactament podem dir que un grup és una permanent minority i quan no. I aquí és on la qüestió es complica. De fet, és la part que realment m'agradaria discutir amb vosaltres perquè crec que és la més complexa de desenvolupar, de quan exactament podem identificar quines característiques exactes hem de fer notar per dir, escolta, si aquest grup està en aquesta posició i aquest grup no. El que diu Petit, en aquest cas, és que aquestes sticky minorities o majorities estan caracteritzades per el que ell diu una independently fixed identity, és a dir, que el fet que t'identifiques amb certa raça, religió, llengua, etc., el que fa és que et precompromet, en aquest cas a les discussions sobre la llengua, in first place, de primeres. És a dir, independentment de quines siguin les teves preferències, no importa en absolut. Perquè el fet que tu ets part d'aquest grup, el que fa és que, precisament perquè estàs estructuralment dins de la societat en una situació de vulnerabilitat, mai estaràs d'entrada en capacitat d'estar en el costat guanyador de la discussió, sinó que sempre partiràs amb un desavantatge a la discussió. Per aquesta independently fixed identity, que et situa d'entrada en una situació de desavantatge, per un motiu, en aquest cas, purament numèric. I que, per tant, estructuralment estàs en una posició de desavantatge. Si les teves preferències s'alineen amb les de la majoria, no hi ha problema. Però si no ho fan, aleshores aquí és quan tot es comença a ser més problemàtic. Perquè estàs, com diu Petit, at the mercy of, a mercè d'una bona voluntat de les persones que són membres del grup majoritari, del grup lingüístic majoritari. Per tant, i aquí entro i acabo amb això, amb la qüestió d'aquest panell, d'aquesta discussió que tindrem ara, sobre les fronteres de la decisió política, on hem de situar exactament qui és el grup que pren la decisió sobre aquestes qüestions. I que sense cap mecanisme, si no ofereixes mecanismes, entre cometes, d'autodeterminació o de presa de decisions en aquests grups que estan desavantatjats en les discussions sobre aquestes qüestions, els situes en una posició de vulnerabilitat, en aquest cas de vulnerabilitat a patir dominació per part de les majories lingüístiques. I això és l'altre tipus de dominació que ara no entraré a parlar perquè segur que s'acaba. No sé quan em queda, però poc. Però vaja, aquest és més o menys el que us volia explicar avui. La meva preocupació per aquest concepte de dominació lingüística, la meva idea d'intentar clarificar i oferir un frame conceptual sobre la qüestió, perquè crec que és una qüestió que no és menor en societats com bilingües o multilingües, com la catalana i com tants altres, a tot el planeta, i que espero que pugui no només oferir bones raons a la filosofia política, sinó que també pugui ajudar a les ciències més empíriques a clarificar què és aquesta cosa que es parla molt sovint, però que mai, almenys al meu parer, s'ha acabat de definir del tot. I ja està. Gràcies per escoltar-me.
So thank you so much for the invitation to Barcelona. I couldn't think of a better opportunity to once again try to present my thoughts, to finally publish on the stuff I only did in German on English. I won't talk much about non-domination, basically, because I think Lewis, in his recent piece in the Journal of Social Philosophy, said everything that is said that is to be said about it, at least when it comes to what I call multinational democracies. And these are the kind of institutions I will focus on now. And the basic idea is mainly that it is somehow an established democracy, and it has in some form sub-state autonomy within the state. So on that basis, there are often still struggles for self-determination or secession. And I will try to discuss those cases now from the angle of constituent power. I think I was done the favor in the first panel that the idea of constituent power was called Republican. And so I won't say so much about Republicanism in my talk. Another Republican angle that it will have, though, is the idea of mixed sovereignty that was also labeled as Republican in the first panel. Maybe another reason in which it is Republican is that the basic idea of focusing on constituent power when it comes to constitutions can be deemed Republican, as opposed to a rather liberal conception of constitutions, which places more virtue of the closing of certain issues in order to preserve the individual freedom. Republican idea of constitution is more focused on trying to constitute the constitution by the people themselves. So let me go a bit deeper into the secessionist debate. I think the secessionist debate has made a huge step forward in the last years, because virtually all recent approaches, I think, share the view that secession from multinational democracies should be discussed differently than it has been discussed before. In the classical debate of secession, there was the idea, okay, either you have a primary right to secede, then you can basically decide in the region whether you would like to secede or not, or you have only a remedial right, then you can only secede unilaterally if you have suffered grave rights violations. And the starting point of my talk is that this is not something that happens in multinational democracies, and this is then also not something that has happened in Catalonia. Of course, probably almost every one of you knows more about Catalonia than I do, so therefore it's a bit strange to talk about this here, but I will try to focus on the theoretical issue. Remedial right theorists then made the second move. Okay, of course, there could be secession in multinational democracies, but only if it's consensual. However, consensual under these circumstances mainly means that the central state would have to agree. And now the recent twist in the secessionist debate is that the central state is not free to decide whether to allow for some kind of secessionist process or not. Instead, we should have some kind of democratic processes that allow a decision over secession or federal reform. And as I said, this is the right angle that I also defended in my book that was published in German. However, I think one piece is still lacking, and this is namely the thing I talked about in the beginning. What is lacking is the idea of constituent power. I find it rather intriguing that we have kind of two debates on self-determination in multinational federations. On the one hand, we have a more philosophical debate that focuses on the normative issues. And on the other hand, we have a debate in political and constitutional theory, which is more oriented in to institutionalizations. In this talk now, I would like to try to combine both approaches, but I will focus on the idea of constituent power. I will combine them, however, because I still think that we still need some normative orientation that is usually given in political philosophy. So combining these two approaches then leads me to two theses I would like to defend. On the one hand, the constituent people need to participate beyond plebiscites. I will explain what I mean by that. And on the other hand, multinational democracies, i.e. the existing state, can block this through their lawful authority. The talk comes in 3 steps. Basically, first, I will introduce the idea of constituted and constituent people. Second, I will enlarge this thought by focusing on federations. And thirdly, I will discuss some possibilities for institutionalization. The distinction of constituent and constituted people actually goes back to Pettit as well. But I think the idea, it might have been defended by other authors. I would be interested if you know of someone. But I think the basic idea can be defended without his idea of freedom as non-domination. So the constituent people are a plural people that is not able to act as such. It's basically the people that we find in any given polity. The main role of that people is to give the constitution. This is the classical idea of constituent power as defended by Abbé Sieyès during the French Revolution. However, as people like Hans Lindahl, I think he's a Dutch constitutional lawyer, if I remember correctly, he said that of course, this might easily lead to the constitutional paradox. This is not his idea. The idea of constitutional paradox is a bit more general, but his idea was simply that, okay, on the one hand, I think I should introduce this idea of this constitutional paradox. So the constitutional paradox is basically that the people should give the institution in order to determine themselves freely in the future. However, in order to give that institution, they need to be represented somehow already. And this then already excludes other forms of self-determination that might be equally adequate for the people in question. And therefore, we always have some forms of exclusion with every possible constitution simply for logical reasons. This is at least my reading of the constitutional paradox. Lindahl now made the rather maybe simple move that in order to kind of solve this paradox, it must be possible to change the constitution further on, even beyond the existing rules of the constitution itself. But another way would also be to simply adapt the constitution to new developments in order to re-actualize this idea of constituent power. Besides this classical role of constituent power, I think constituent power will also be always in play through less closely regulated forms of participation. I think it is in play, for example, in public deliberation, not only if we talk about the question in what kind of state we want to live in, what kind of constitution we want to have, what kind of people we are, but also if we just talk about ordinary issues of policies. There we simply use basic rights that we could use in all kinds of ways, but we use it in those ways that we that we think right and important, and thereby can actualize our constituent power in order to transform the existing constitution as a lived in constitution in this direction that we think the state should develop. Constituent power can also come into play, of course, classically through civil disobedience. If we think, for example, some forms of policies have been decided on undemocratically, then we can use our constituent power as well. On the other hand, we always also need the idea of the constituted people. And this is then the state as a corporate agent that represents the constituted people. Only this state can really claim to speak in the name of the whole people. And I assume this is also the case in multinational democracies. Another important function is that we realize a rule of law and not a rule of man. And this more constituted form of power can also come into play through more closely regulated participation, like going to court or the mere act of voting. Now I realize that I already talked quite long about the basic idea. I hope to get a bit more quicker when talking now about the real issues. So I assumed now that there's only one people existing. And of course, this is not the case in multinational democracies. One way to approach this would be to constitutional theory. Stephen Tierney, in his recent book on federal constitution, put the basic idea of federalism in this way, that it balances pluralism and union. It is formed out of territorial subjects, and importantly, this can lead either to one or to more demos. His example, where we have a federation with only one demos, is the US, where the states came together and by drafting the constitution became one demos. At least they claimed so, and this then had to be reactualized over the centuries. However, if we have more than one demos, then we will have a thing that you might call asymmetrical, or that is often called asymmetrical federalism, and that we find, for example, in Canada. Spain might be now an example that is kind of lingering in between. Tierney isn't really sure whether it is a federation or not in his book. In any case, I don't need to explain here that with Spain, we find the very problem with the constitutionalist approach, that constitutions always have inscribed a certain form of conservatism into themselves, because first the reform of the autonomy arrangement was deemed unconstitutional, and later on, of course, it was forbidden to make a secessionist referendum. And this then is an example for how the constitution works as a kind of structure of domination, as Tully has called this. So we need to turn to political theory in order to find a way out of this. And here I draw on the recent paper of Peter Niesen, who distinguished three practices of constituent power. The first is articulation, the other is activation, and the third is exercise. First, to articulation. This can never be forbidden by an existing constitution, and even liberalism thinks that this should not be the case, simply because you still can articulate that you want to have a state of your own. This is simply part of the freedom of speech. The liberal approach is then to try to graft a constitutional right to secede in order to bring the separatist movement that may evolve out of this into the rule of law. One basic problem with this approach is, what if we don't actually have such a constitutional right to secede? If we would like to institutionalize it, we would have the very same conflicts than we would have if we face the specter of constituent power head on. And this is what I want to focus on now. Activation, according to Peter Niesen, is the idea of kind of creating or changing constituent power. His example for this is the unilateral referendum on secession in Catalonia. And his basic critique of that referendum is that it tried to activate and exercise constituent power at the same time. It tried to build a new kind of constituent power, a new kind of demos, and at the same time, it tried to exercise this. This, however, does not live up to the basic idea of constituent power, because for Niesen, this would have to be an authority that can be kind of justified to all who live in an already existing state. And this can not be done at once by activating and exercising. However, Niesen argues that the unsuccessful secession referendum might have been successful in this sense that it was part of a movement in actually activating what he calls a pouvoir constituant mixed. This is the idea that was popularized by Habermas. The basic idea is that in this sense, we actually have a kind of federal constituent power already existing. On the one hand, we have the demos of the whole state, and on the other hand, we have, at least in some regions, additional constituent powers that are maybe at now more, at least a bit more recognized than they have been before. I would be interested, though, what you think about this. I also agree with Niesen and, for example, Anna Stilts that some kind of federation, some kind of true federation that would be built out of this would be normatively preferable, because under these conditions, everyone can determine themselves in that kind of demos that he identifies most strongly with. However, I think the very idea of constituent power is that it can't be kind of hedged through specific purposes for normative reasons. The very idea of constituent power is that the people can decide for themselves, and therefore they cannot be conferred to, okay, you might have some kind of deepening of the federation, but that's it. They need also be, in principle, allowed to secede. And I think the best way to do this is through a participatory process that tries to actually combine the activation and the exercise of constituent power through a deliberative and participatory process. And this is now the last part of my talk, what I call participatory plebiscites. There's not much new under the sun. The basic idea may be to start with the reference on the secession of Quebec, which basically said, okay, if there's clear majority on a clear question, then there should be a duty to negotiate between the relevant parties. And this was what Lluís defended in his recent paper. This should not lead to a unilateral secession, but it can't also lead to unilateral to a unilateral preservance of the existing state. Instead, the parties need to negotiate it. However, I think there are certain problems with this classical suggestion that also has been made by Tully. One problem can be also made, one point can be made quite straightforwardly empirically. This reference then became usurped by the constituent power of the existing state in Canada. Basically, the two parliaments said that they can decide for themselves what a clear majority on a clear question is. And this also then already suggests two basic problems of referenda as a form of participation. It is only a kind of punctual participation. We have a lack of deliberation, and therefore much of the problems that need to be solved are to be solved before and after the referendum. A way to do this, and again, nothing new under the sun, is a deliberation on the referendum in the region in question through deliberative mini-publics assembled by lot, because then the constituent people would actually come into play, not only in the referendum, but also in drafting the referendum. I think the most important normative suggestion would be that it should be not a yes or no a referendum, but a referendum on whether to have secession or federal reform. And this is now my last slide. After the referendum, depending on the outcome, or firstly, irrespective of the outcome, the negotiation delegations would have to be determined again by such kind of constituent processes. I don't claim that professional politicians cannot be part of this, but there would have to some kind of institutional mechanisms that makes sure that they actually change their roles in becoming part of the constituent people. If there has been a majority for federal reform, the whole federation or the whole state needs to be included. And of course, this is often a huge problem, because then if we have more veto players and often nothing changes. And I don't mean to I don't mean to deny this. This will often lead the situation at the status quo ante. If we have a secession, I think this can only be denied if it would lead to domination of internal minorities, or at least if the domination of internal minorities would be gravely enhanced, such as with indigenous people in Quebec, it should say here, not in Canada, in Quebec. I think you get hopefully the idea of this kind of process, and I think the idea I would like to add to this is simply that we could combine some kind of activating and exercising constituent power by making the point that the constituent self-determination, the question of who the people actually are, could be crafted out in this process itself. It would be a long process that could lead to actually new kinds of people, whatever that means. This would have to be decided in a truly democratic way. Okay, what if those nice processes do not work off? Who has the last word? I don't think that it should be the international community, because the democratic credentials of the international community are sadly currently much worse than we will find in multinational democracies. Therefore, in the end, the existing state would have some kind of possibility, and also in the end a right to block the constituent power, because it can claim lawful authority. It can claim to have a constitution that somehow speaks for the whole existing people. On the other hand, however, the activation of constituent power would still be possible. I don't think to ongoing contestation, I don't think that secessionist conflict should go on and on and on. There are many other problems to solve, for example, when it comes to economic justice, that needs to be addressed as well. However, when time comes, they may be iterated, and therefore there will be no last word. In the end, thank you very much.
Well, so the title of this presentation is Toward the Republican Theory of Secession. It's the same title of the article that I just published in the Journal of Social Philosophy, which actually is a revised and refined version of one of the last chapters of my PhD dissertation. Okay. The research question, both of the dissertation and actually that I tried to answer it in this last chapter in the article, is the following one: is what kind of right to secede from a modern democratic state, if any, can be acknowledged from a democratic Republican viewpoint? That means that I am not thinking about secession generally speaking. I am not thinking about secession from a colonial empire or from an authoritarian state, for instance, but specifically about secession from democratic states. Because I think that it is there, it is when secession or a secession attempt happens in a democratic context where the hard problem of secession for democratic theory indeed arises. So in trying to answer this question, I basically try to link both two bodies of literature. On the one hand, theories of right of secession and republicanism. Theories of right of secession as a field within political philosophy arose more or less during the 1980s. And normally the people who have worked on the field have worked explicitly or implicitly from the point of view of liberalism, broadly speaking, okay, from the language and the concepts of the liberal political tradition. While in the last years, different authors, Professor Oldenbourg or myself, or I think also in Amandine Català, for instance, have tried to apply the language, the concepts, the values of the Republican tradition to the problem of secession. But largely speaking, until very recently, all theories of secession have worked from the liberal point of view. On the other hand, republicanism as a theory, as most theories of a state, have understood that the borders of the state are obviously legitimate, and that when Republicans speak about the society or the political community, they always take for granted that the society or the political community is the state in the end. But this is something that is a matter of discussion in real life. So I think that republicanism needs a theory of secession. Well, first of all, theories of right of secession used to be divided between theories of unilateral secession and of constitutional secession. And the main point of interest in the literature is unilateral secession, actually, is the most contentious issue. The three main approaches to secession in normative literature are basically plebiscitarian theories, or also called democratic or associative theories, ascriptive theories, and remedial theories. Plebiscitarian theories say that secession is a primary right for territorially concentrated groups willing to create a state and having the power to, having the capability to create a state. So basically, what justifies a secession attempt is not language, it's not culture, it's not injustice. The people trying to secede has not to be necessarily subject to injustice, but only the democratic will of the people who wants to secede. On the other hand, ascriptive theories think that the subject of the right of secession are cultural groups, certain kind of cultural groups with a distinct identity that justifies a sovereignty claim. And finally, remedial theories think that secession is not a primary right, but only a remedial right, a last resort in front of certain injustices like human rights violations, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and so on. On the other hand, republicanism, as we have been talking today, is a tradition. It can be defined in many ways, but the mainstream today is to say that the main value of republicanism is freedom, understood as non-domination. Domination can be understood as vulnerability in front of an arbitrary power, in front of a power, either private or public power, capable of taking decisions or making decisions on our lives without having to consider our interests and our opinions. That's more or less a way to define arbitrary power. So the way to, on the other hand, domination is a matter of degree. This is important. You are not either free or dominated, but rather you are more free or more dominated. It comes in degrees. And the way to avoid, or at least to minimize domination, is to control and to divide power, okay? So the private powers have to be divided and controlled by the public powers. The public powers as well have to be divided and controlled by citizenship, by an active and empowered citizenship, in order to ensure the maximum possible level of freedom. One of the reasons why in classical republicanism, and this is something that, for instance, Madison or Machiavelli insists, one of the reasons why public powers should be divided is because society and politics is a scenario of conflict. Okay, politics are conflictive, as David Casas explained this morning. And conflicts are always conflicts between factions, between organized groups with different interests, different political agendas that try to control the power in order to develop their agendas. So the argument goes, we have to divide public powers in order to ensure that no faction will ever win absolute power over the other factions. So no faction will ever be capable of oppress, of dominating the other factions. Okay, this is an important point for my argument on secession. On the other hand, republicanism comes in different flavors, and republicanism can be more oligarchic or more democratic. And the point of division in this sense is how many people do you include in Republican citizenship. The more democratic you are, the more people you include. The more oligarchic you are, the more people you exclude from full Republican citizenship. Since I am talking about democratic republicanism, that means that non-domination and inclusion are the main concerns of democratic republicanism. And so we have to take them into account when talking about secession. So one of the main points of my article is that secession conflicts should be understood as factional conflicts. The difference between secession conflicts and other conflicts that we experience in democratic life, like capital labor, left and right, conflicts between different religious communities or whatever, is that in secession conflicts, the factions in conflict
are not trying to win power within the state, but rather they are conflicting over the very borders of the state. One of the factions, secessionists, try to win power in order to create a new state out of the territory of an existing state, while the whole state, and generally speaking, the unionists, the people who are opposed to independence, try to keep the state united, try to block this attempt of secession. And these conflicts are the ultimate phase, the most extreme phase of the center-periphery conflict, which is a typical conflict in modern democracies. Conflict between, as Sergi put it before, between permanent majorities and permanent minorities. Conflicts that go basically around three areas of issues. Economy, that means the territorial distribution of the economic resources of the state. Territory, that means the territorial organization of the political power, if the state is more centralized or more decentralized, or where is the capital or wherever. And identity, which is the official language of the state, which is the language of the schools, and so on. So these are the main areas of the conflict between the center and the periphery. And these are conflicts normally between permanent majorities and permanent minorities. In my view, these conflicts imply four threats for these democratic Republican values of freedom and inclusion. And no, I will explain now which are those four threats. And no current unilateral theory of right of secession is able to overcome all of them at once. The first threat is the threat of exclusion, the threat that some people who will be directly affected by secession, people who will be under the rule of the new state, if the new state is created, can be excluded from the decision on creating the new state, or even on citizenship of the new state altogether. I think this is a threat that is especially linked to ascriptive theories, because if you define the subject of the right of secession in cultural or even in ethnic terms, then it's easy to arrive to the conclusion that people who are living in the territory that may secede, but that do not share the culture of the group that is supposed to have the right to secede, may be excluded from the decision, or may be excluded from citizenship. Think about Quebec, for instance. If we say Quebec has the right to secede, for instance, a unilateral right of secession because they have a distinctive culture based upon French language, for instance, that someone may conclude that Anglophone Quebecers should not have a say on the decision, or that if the new state is created, then Anglophones can be excluded from citizenship. So this is a risk for the value of inclusion. On the other hand, I think that there is the risk of the threat of blackmailing minorities. That means that if you have a too permissive approach to secession, then powerful minorities can use it in order to block the democratic process. In order to, for instance, imagine that a rich neighborhood of a city in a third world country wants to. I mean, the left-wing party wins the election in that country, and he wants, and this government wants to raise taxes. So the rich people in a neighborhood says, you know, we are going to secede, and we are going to organize our neighborhood as a tax haven, and we are not going to pay taxes for this welfare state that they want to build. So this is a risk for the democratic process because you are giving too much power to people who are already powerful. Okay. So, and I think this is a risk that is especially linked to plebiscitarian theories, precisely because they are the most permissive approach to secession. They put no especially robust constraints on a secession attempt. And finally, we have the threat of arbitrary permanent majorities. That means that if we go to the other extreme, if we say, as remedialist theory says, look, the borders of the state cannot be changed unless secessionists prove that they are being victims of an injustice, then we are assuming that the borders of the state are obviously legitimate, but the borders of the state are the result of not very democratic processes. Normally, they are not the result of a Rousseauian or Kantian or Lockean social contract in which everybody agrees to. No, they are the result of wars, marriages, of invasions, and so on. And since we actually have permanent majorities and permanent minorities within these states, it's kind of unfair to look at permanent minorities and say, look, you have to endure your tough historical lag. And if, for instance, the permanent majority decides that your language is no longer useful and can be erased, which can be done by strictly democratic procedures. It's not a matter of being in an authoritarian or in a democratic state. It's just a matter of numbers somehow. If the permanent majority decides arbitrarily to erase a regional language, for instance, then, well, tough luck. You have lost a war in the past, and that's your tough luck. I think this is kind of unfair, and it's a way of dominating people for instance, in issues like language. And finally, the last threat is the threat of instability. That means that if you handle a secession conflict in a way that one of the sides of the conflict doesn't regard as legitimate, then probably this will end up in instability. It will end up in rebellions. It will end up in civil disobedience. It will end up in instability for the state as a whole. And this is something that it is bad, taking into account the public goods that the state should provide in Republican terms, like security, stability, freedom, and so on. So I think that a democratic Republican theory of secession should shift, because in the end, when you are trying to answer who has to have a unilateral right of secession, in the end, you are asking who is a sovereign, who is the legitimate sovereign of a territory. And in my view, this is not a theoretical issue. This is a political issue. It's an issue that is closer to the question of who should govern, whether the left-wing parties or the right-wing parties. This doesn't accept a theoretical answer. This is the very matter of the conflict. And the point of republicanism is to organize institutions so that these conflicts can be channeled, can be civilized through non-dominating means. And I think that something similar needs to be done in secession conflicts and, generally speaking, in conflicts on sovereignty. So the focus here, and this is something that I disagree with most remedial theorists, I think that the focus of a theory of secession should be, in the first place, legitimacy over justice, which are two different values. I will not develop. I see Vosacoma smiling because we have the discussion before. But Josep Lluís Martí actually published an article on secession and legitimacy recently as well. So this is something that is emerging in the literature as well. And I think that all end up in a non-unilateralist logic, that secession conflicts should be addressed as far as possible from frameworks that doesn't allow neither secessionists nor the state the power to unilaterally decide the result of the conflict. In my view, a good place to start is by reading the reference of the Supreme Court of Canada in the case of Quebec. Because in the case of Quebec, as you may know, in the 1990s, after two referendums on sovereignty, the Supreme Court of Canada was asked by the federal government whether Quebec had the right to unilaterally secede from Canada, either under the Canadian constitutional law or under international law. And on the one hand, the court said something that everybody expected, that no, Quebec has not the right to unilaterally secede because they are not a colony, they are not an oppressed people, and so on. But, and this was kind of a surprise for many people, but on the other hand, if a clear majority of Quebecers answered yes to a clear question on secession in a referendum, then the government of Canada and the rest of Canada cannot only ignore this result. They are constitutionally, they have the constitutional obligation to negotiate with this secessionist Quebec. Because then when what you have, and this is something that links with what Professor Oldenbourg was developing in his presentation, you don't have just one democratic majority in Canada and then a secessionist minority in Quebec. You have two democratic majorities who have to negotiate with each other. So I think that a democratic Republican theory of secession should be, let's say, a theory of good practices, good non-unilateralist practices, in order to organize, to civilize secession conflicts. I think that the three main points of theory like that should be, on the one hand, to recognize a non-unilateral right of secession for any territorially concentrated group. It's kind of a mixed viewpoint between the different approaches that we have already seen. And this is a plebiscitarian element, that any group of people in territorially concentrated who clearly wants to secede has to have democratic mechanisms to express this will and to pursue a negotiated process with the state. And on the other hand, the state has also the right to, let's say, defend its unity, but not just by blocking the secession attempt and saying, well, you are not powerful enough to secede, so just endure your tough luck. But the state has to have some form of obligation to negotiate with a secessionist majority. And on the other hand, and this is the remedial part of the theory, if one of the two sides is unilateralist or is oppressive or is a failing or a failed political community, then the other side wins legitimacy in order to act unilaterally. What does it mean? Imagine that you have a secession attempt by a group of people who have, with a clear majority, with a deliberative process, I mean, in the best conditions that you can imagine, and the state repeatedly refuses to negotiate with these people. At some point, that gives legitimacy to these people to make a unilateral move. This is something that somehow appears as well in the reference of the Supreme Court of Canada. Somehow, it doesn't say explicitly that, but at the end of the reference, it says, well, what happens if negotiations between the two parts fail? Well, then we are not in the realm of constitutional law, we are in the realm of politics, and this is not our business. But what we can say is that if one of the two sides refuses to negotiate in good faith with the other, then that probably will give legitimacy to the other side to make a unilateral move. It's a very soft part of the reference, but it is there. Or imagine that one of the two sides is an oppressive side. Imagine that secessionists want to secede in order to undertake ethnic cleansing, for instance. Well, I think that this gives legitimacy to the state to protect the part of the population that would be at risk in case of secession. Or imagine that we are in front of a group of people that are obviously not capable of organizing a functional state for any reason we can imagine, because they are a deeply divided society or wherever. Or imagine that we are in a failed state, that secessionists are trying to separate from a state that is crumbling, like think about Yugoslavia, for instance. Well, that probably gives legitimacy to a unilateral move as well. So this is the remedial part of the theory. I am just 1 minute, I'm finishing. There are a lot of questions on how this framework could be developed. Some of them I addressed in the article, but the main one is that whether this framework should be under constitutional law or under international law. I will not develop this question because I'm running out of time, but there are good reasons for each approach, and probably they are not mutually exclusive. You can think in a combination of both. And well, these are the conclusions, but I have already explained them, so whatever. Thank you.
Thank you for the three presentations. I enjoyed them all, but I have a question for Lluís, which also might extend to Andreas. So it's a question on secession. So I think I agree with you, Lluís, that the question about legitimacy should have some, at least we can differentiate. One thing is the question of legitimacy and the other is a question of justice. I agree with you that legitimacy has priority, but someone might resist that view. But still, these are two different questions, and it makes sense actually that we address them separately. So I'm interested about the question of legitimacy as well. And I agree with you and with Andreas that so when we have competing DMOI, it's not, as you know, that was part of my argument in my paper as well. It's not obvious how we can give priority to any of them in a decision like this. And in that sense, every attempt to justify unilaterality, it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult. And if we had some way of identifying which is the relevant demos that is independent of the circumstances of the fact or the disagreements that people have, because there are always disagreements. So you will always find people who have different views about who is the relevant demos here. But if we had an independent access to identifying which is the relevant demos, of course, the problem would be solved or half solved at least. But that's exactly what we are lacking. So every method that we can imagine needs to be part of the same practice. And I think I sympathize with what you were trying to do, Lluís, in identifying reasons that might strengthen the case of one side or the other. So having said this, and I sympathize with this, I think now listening to you, actually, I think something that I didn't express in my paper, and I think that it's also fair to be said. So when you think about legitimacy in general, Petit, that we have mentioned several times today, his view on legitimacy is that when you say that a particular democratic system or a particular political system is legitimate, what he believes is that accepting something as legitimate doesn't mean that you have the duty to obey. So contrary to a well-settled tradition in political philosophy, he doesn't equate political legitimacy with the duty to obey. What he says is, if you recognize a system as legitimate, you have the duty not to make a coup d'etat, not to destroy the system, not to ignore what the authorities are saying, but perhaps not the duty to obey. And this actually relates to civil disobedience and the debate on civil disobedience, because we want to say that even legitimate systems are compatible with the right to civil disobedience. So now if you make the parallel to your case, the case of secession, if you said, you know, of course, if the state that from which there's a particular territory that wants to secede is a failing state, or if there are problems, systematic problems or gross injustices, then we might accept the kind of remedial approach, the remedial logic, now to be applied here on legitimacy. But imagine that this is not the case. So you have a normal state. Let's take the case of Canada, right? So you have a democratic system, imperfect, many problems, of course, as any other system, but it's quite reasonable. And you might agree that the Canadian government is more or less legitimate. So then if you accept this, what is the consequence? What is the correlate of this? Well, you might say, if you follow Petit, you might say not that you have the duty to obey. Maybe that would be too strong. But at least if you say that the system is legitimate, at least you might think that you have the pro tanto duty to obey. So unless you can prove that there is some other reason that you might invoke to disobey, well, in principle, you should respect the system, because that's what follows from saying that it's legitimate. And now coming to your point about how to justify certain unilateral moves, well, the question is what kind of moves? Because if the move is actually to make a secession, then this looks like what Petit exactly rejects, right? Like making a coup d'etat or destroying the system, and this is exactly what it seems that it cannot follow from the recognition that the system is legitimate. But if you put the example, and I finish with that, but you put the example of what we do if the majority of the larger state systematically blocks or ignores what the majority of that territory wants to do. Well, you might say this might be a reason to justify some unilaterality. Yeah, yes, but of what movement, right? Again, perhaps not of secession, but maybe unilateral move to what? That's a question. What kind of unilaterality would be justified here? Because otherwise it collapses with the idea that if what you're saying is, well, in this case, referendum, an illegal referendum or a unilateral declaration of independence might be eventually justified, then this is equivalent to say a coup d'etat could be justified. And in principle, that doesn't seem to be possible. That's the question.
Okay. Thank you very much for all these presentations. I wanted to add perhaps to Andreas that it would be interesting to explore Bruce Ackerman with the people when you think about constituent power, okay, or this different ways to deal with constitutional reform or constitutional revolution. He actually talks about revolutionary reform because there may be ways in between. And when you think about deliberation, that you are worried that referendums are not deliberative, well, there are other ways than tyranny. If you go to a previous book, it has this kind of book, I think it's called Deliberative Referendums, perhaps, or something like that. Or and also I think that you might be excluding more traditional ways of representative democracy. Actually, one good point of traditional representative democracy is this point of deliberation. So I'm not sure that you have to find it in these mini publics. Maybe this can be a complement, but I don't think that I would charge them with that big duty. Anyway, that was a point for you, Andreas. And then it comes to Lluís, and I like this idea. I think in a previous seminar, I told Lluís, there's a problem of this non-unilateralist approach, because if the other side doesn't want to negotiate, and actually the other side is more powerful, you are then blocked. What do we do if, yeah, you have to negotiate, but if the other party is not negotiating? And I realize now, at least in this presentation, you made clear that, against a unilateralist state, then there can be a unilateral right to secede. I understood. So fantastic. Okay, so that's good, because I think you answered the question of my last seminar, at least a bit. So you are trying to find some doors, that you are not putting it too easy for someone to block this democratic demand. When it comes to legitimacy and justice, this was a kind of appeal. We disagreed, actually, also with Lluís, because I think that you are not talking about legitimacy. You are talking about democratic legitimacy, which is a kind of legitimacy. But in my opinion, actually, when you were talking about Petit now, or you were talking about if a state is legitimate, even if a constitutional order is legitimate, it not only includes the source of democracy, it also includes a minimal justice base, or minimally just. It also includes this kind of, especially in liberal democratic orders, it includes the law. So legitimacy, it's a kind of very broad concept, that it includes justice or morality, it includes democracy, it includes legality, especially. It includes, actually, there's other less normative points also in legitimacy. Max Weber was saying legitimacy comes from law, tradition, and charisma, if I'm not wrong, in the politics as a vocation. So I think when you are talking about legitimacy, you are talking about democratic legitimacy and not legitimacy in general, because it's a broader concept which includes justice. That's why I was telling you, I'm not sure about this, but that's why we disagreed. Thank you.
Other questions?
Thanks. This is a question for Sergi, or I don't know how you pronounce your name. Sergi. Okay. So I thought it was very interesting that you use the notion of domination to talk about language. And so I was thinking that the intuitions that we have about linguistic domination, they seem to apply primarily when there are national groups that have lived in a territory for a long period of time, and then the institutions of the state operate in ways that disadvantage them. But then people have different intuitions when it comes to the rights of like immigrant groups, even if there's a large immigration in an area, let's say, I don't know, Chinese immigrants in San Francisco area, whether we would count them as suffering from linguistic domination if the institutions of the state operate in ways that disadvantage them or not. Would you separate the claims of national groups and immigrant groups?
Thanks. I had another question for Sergi. So maybe it is because you didn't get the time to explain about domination or what you call horizontal relationship of linguistic domination, but the way you exposed your work, like it seemed that the way you were exposing it, so I was wondering what's the difference between your take on linguistic domination and a liberal approach to linguistic domination? Because I know it is because you didn't get to the second part probably, but you focus mainly on how states capacity to interfere arbitrarily in our lives endangers our freedom. And so if you could very shortly explain this difference. And also a suggestion, or when you said it, I found it problematic. So you used the metaphor horizontal domination to talk about what Petit calls domination. And I think that might be problematic because, so in the Republican tradition, domination, it is precisely not about horizontal relationships, or it is about relationship that might be horizontal in terms of formal law, but not in terms of actual power. So it could be counterintuitive in terms of explaining your point. That's it. Thanks.
Yeah. So thank you very much for all the questions. Well, first of all, about legitimacy, I have to do a lot of work and go deeper into the concepts of both justice and legitimacy, and try to figure out what my intuition, but it's just an intuition, is that there are two different and independent concepts. Basically, because the point of legitimacy is that you can recognize that, I mean, you can think that a government is doing unjust things, and even very unjust things, and even then recognizing this government as a legitimate government. So at least in some level, they are two independent or at least autonomous concepts. Because if not, the distinction, if you only recognize as legitimate those governments that you think that are fulfilling your principles of justice, then governments would be quite unstable, because conceptions of justice are a matter of conflict as such. Legitimacy, I mean, when we discuss about legitimacy, we are discussing, at least in some level, about how do we organize conflicts about things like justice. I'm explaining my mind. Okay. So on the other hand, and this links your first question and the question by Josep Lluís, I increasingly think that normative theory about secession should be normative theory about the right to do what in order to achieve secession. Let me put an example. Harry Beran, who arguably, as far as I know, was the first one to open the debate on secession in modern political philosophy, if I'm not wrong. He was a proponent of a plebiscitarian theory of secession. So he basically thinks, for instance, if California wants to secede, if a clear majority of the people of California wants to secede from the United States, they should have the right to do it. Okay, does it mean that if Harry Beran thinks that if the federal government opposes this secession attempt and tries to block it through force, Harry Beran would agree that Californians have the right to undertake an armed uprising against the federal government? I will bet that he was not saying that. I will bet that he was probably saying something like, the people of California has the moral right to secede from the United States if they want to secede by democratic means and so on. And if the federal government used the force to block this attempt, then this will be morally wrong. Okay, this will be morally wrong, but what if it happens? Will be Harry Beran defending the right of Californians to use arms to oppose? I don't think so. he probably will think that Californians will be right to protest against it. He may even be in favor of some form of civil disobedience and so on, but not to the point of justifying an extreme measure like an uprising. I think that when we speak about the right of secession, and I'm trying to work on that right now, we should clarify what do we think is justified to do in each situation in order to defend a secessionist claim, even if we think that it is fully justified. The point is, well, but what about the means? And my intuition is that this will be more easy to answer if we take into account, for starters, if we use a consequentialist logic in terms of in each situation, which means will lead to a better resolution to the conflict in terms of protecting freedom as non-domination, protecting democracy, and so on. And on the other hand, we should also take into account that the legitimacy is not a matter of yes or no, it's a matter of degree as well. So it is not the same thing if you have, let's say, 60% of the population of one territory favoring secession, than if you have, for instance, 80% of the population. Think about, for instance, Ireland, the case of Southern Ireland. I mean, Southern Ireland, it was not a colony of the, even if they say that it was a colony, actually they were members of the United Kingdom. They sent representatives to the UK Parliament in a time in which the United Kingdom was not a full democracy, but it was compared to the standards of the time, it was fairly a democratic state, and it was actually democratizing. It was deepening its democracy. And it was at that time that the Irish took arms to defend independence and so on. Yeah, okay, we can discuss if it was legitimate or not. But if we discuss it, we must take into account that in Southern Ireland, the Sinn Féin was like 80% of the votes in elections. So, and this is the reason why the uprising succeeded in large part, because they had a lot of legitimacy among the civilian population. So this is something that, in order to evaluate the means that secessionists could use at each time, you had to take into account at least consequentialist considerations, and also considerations about the amount of democratic legitimacy that that secessionists have in each case. I don't know if I answered the, yep.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for reminding me of Ackerman and Tierney. At least Tierney I had in an earlier version. Maybe I should look into Ackerman as well. But let me just make a short remark on the idea of focusing so much on the deliberative mini-publics. I think you're right that this is not the only possible solution to institutionalize these kind of processes. However, I really do think that parliaments, as they are established as constituted powers, are the right arena either. I think one reason is conceptual. This is basically just the distinction between constituent and constituted power. And if I want to defend a secessionist theory based on constituent power, I can't simply go to the parliament and says, okay, you decide on that, because they are constituted powers. I think that the conceptual reason is not very strong. We would need more normative reasoning behind this. And I really think I should think more about this, but I think an actually quite strong and consequentialist reason is that these constituted powers always have entrenched self-interests. And therefore, the parliament of the central state says, no, we want to decide on that region as well. We want to continue to decide on this region. And we want to continue to have disposal of the resources that are there. And the parliaments in the secessionist region have an even stronger claim. Oh, we want to have an own state. Imagine Pau can become constitutional head of the constitutional court in Catalonia and stuff like this. And therefore, I think we really shouldn't underestimate this kind of reasoning. And then it might be some kind of institution where we have ordinary citizens, where we have activists, where we have also some parliaments, but it really should be a different kind of institution. I really think that this is the most important building block of a better democratic process.
Okay, thank you for your questions. So about the horizontality issue that you just mentioned, your recommendation, I think I partially disagree. So I see your point. In fact, you told me something like that some days ago about this might make this use that you are using of horizontal might be misleading. And I kind of agree. But so the first time of my research on that, on linguistic domination, was focused on interpersonal relationships. So I was thinking on, a lot of my colleagues working on linguistic justice, they basically focus on general principles of justice about how to distribute, for instance, resources between language groups and this kind of stuff. And I was thinking, even if you, in an ideal society where you distribute fairly resources between language groups and so forth, you can still imagine some linguistic injustices between persons in their daily linguistic communication. Because, for instance, social norms that say like, oh, this language is more polite than this other. You should use always this language because whatever reason, because it's more used everywhere, and etc. etc. So even if that happens in interpersonal relationships, horizontal relationships, between equals, it can still something wrong happen in linguistic relationships. And I wanted to emphasize that. That's the reason I use the term horizontal. Like, it's not necessary that this happened between a boss and a worker and so forth. So that's the reason I use this concept. But I kind of agree with your concern and Luis' concerns. I'm not sure about your first question. You asked me about if I can differ my approach from a more liberal one. Why choosing republicanism instead to do your normative work? Okay. Yeah, that's a prototypical question for all Republicans. Why you use republicanism to deal with socioeconomic justice? No, but I see the point. Probably first of all was because in general, all people working on my field are, as I said, more thinking about issues of distributive justice per se, that are most of the time, at least in my field, more liberal based, like drum rolls, etc., etc. And I was more concerned about this kind of power asymmetries that happen between people that are not usually part of these more Rawlsian liberal discussions. And I had the impression that republicanism offered to you better tools to understand this kind of stuff than traditional Rawlsian theories of justice. And that was basically, it's like, for me, republicanism or liberalism is just a tool. Like a box that you can use several different tools, and for me, republicanism helped me to understand better this kind of stuff than the liberal tradition. So yeah, that's the reason.
That was my intuition, just because I guess the second part of your presentation was about private.
Exactly.
That was
exactly.
More evidence.
Yeah. And Victoria. Okay. But your question, yeah, that's a classical question for everybody that is working on this kind of not only language but multicultural stuff, like Kimblica, Alan Patten, and people that works on that know what happened with migrants, because most of us are like more concerned usually with national minorities or stateless nations or whatever expression, the different expressions that you can use to address that issues. I have so before Sarah mentioned one paper that I published recently that if with the question whether people have a right to speak their own language, and there I address more or less this kind of issue regarding migrants. And what I explained there is that, or my thesis in this paper is that everybody has a right to use their own language in their private sphere, but when we go to the public one, this change a little bit, because rights usually implies in the prototypical Holfindian approach implies some kind of duties, etc., etc. So this implies that the other have some duties vis-a-vis you, and the interests that are linked to languages might differ depending if you are a long settled group or you're a migrant group. So my thesis in the paper is something like, prima facie, only groups that are long established in a territory have a right and the freedom to speak their own language in public life. Prima facie. That does not mean that you cannot include other groups. So my first intuition was something like, and explaining more plainly, is something like, if you have a group living in a place for a long time, you cannot just go there and say to them, okay, no, now you have to forget about that and you have to speak my language instead of the language that you are speaking right now, right? So that was my concern was, okay, this local group always should have the right to speak their own language. And if you go there, you have to be accommodated to that. That does not mean that you cannot try like democratically to say, okay, I would like also my language to be included in the community. I'm okay with that. As long as this is the result of a procedure, a democratic procedure, once you are incorporated into the community. So yeah, that was more or less my argument there. So it's also true that this paper is more focused on the long established groups. And it's possible that I kind of forget about migrant issues and how to incorporate migrant issues when discussing about linguistic domination. At the same time, there's also some people working on language and domination and migrants. So she's a colleague that is working from Israel, and which her argument says, and it's kind of appealing, it's that in order to avoid domination for migrants, it's probably the best we can do for them, or the best that the state, the receiving state can do for migrants, is to try first linguistically accommodate them in a way that, like for instance, facilitate that they learn their own language, but at the same time, and even more important, that they learn the local language, because it's the way they will have enough skills to not being dominated by others. Like for instance, to have equal opportunities to participate in the political community and control power, for instance, and so forth and so forth. So maybe that's kind of reply to your question about what we should do. But I know I don't have a proper answers to that issue yet, I think.